It was early morning when the earth began to tremble beneath the feet of the children and their teachers. The school had been a safe haven, a place where the young minds were nurtured and the days passed with the innocence that only childhood can offer. But as the first tremor shook the ground, that safety was shattered. The walls cracked, the ceiling groaned, and the very foundation of their world seemed to split apart. In a matter of seconds, the building became a chaotic mess of falling beams, shattered windows, and collapsing walls. The students, many of them too young to understand the gravity of the situation, were thrown to the ground by the force of the impact. Their screams, once filled with laughter and playfulness, now echoed with terror. Some tried to crawl away, but the debris and dust were too thick, too overwhelming. The school that had once been a beacon of knowledge and community now lay in ruins, an unforgiving reminder of the violence that war had brought to their doorstep. Among the rubble, the teachers who had tried to protect their students were now trapped, their bodies pinned under fallen beams and concrete blocks. The headmaster, a kind and stern man, was buried deep beneath the ruins, his last thoughts likely for the children he had devoted his life to educating. His efforts to shield them had been in vain, and now the very people he had cared for were left to fend for themselves in a world that had suddenly turned against them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm. The children, some still in shock, others too young to grasp what had just happened, huddled together in fear. Their small, fragile bodies were no match for the weight of the destruction that had engulfed them. As they struggled to understand their new reality, their minds raced with questions that had no answers. Were they the lucky ones, or had they just witnessed the end of everything they had known? Outside, the battle raged on, the sound of artillery and gunfire shaking the very ground they lay upon. But inside the rubble, there was only confusion and despair. They were no longer in a school, no longer in a safe space. The school had become their tomb, the walls that once offered protection, now a prison. The children clung to each other, their fear palpable in the air. But even that fear couldn't shield them from the weight of their reality. In the chaos, some children managed to crawl toward the few remaining open spaces in the wreckage. They called out for their friends, their teachers, their families, but the sound of their voices was swallowed by the dust and debris. The air was thick with smoke, and the once bright classrooms had turned into a labyrinth of death and despair. Each movement felt like a struggle for survival, each breath a desperate attempt to stay alive. The older children, those who had a sense of what was happening, took charge. They tried to organize the younger ones, pulling them away from the debris, shielding them from the dangers that lurked around every corner. But even they were powerless against the magnitude of the destruction. They could only watch as the hope that had once filled these halls crumbled, piece by piece beneath their feet. As the hours passed, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of helplessness. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were trapped, surrounded by walls of concrete and stone, with no way out. Outside, the world continued its march toward destruction, but inside there was only darkness and despair. The children, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, clung to each other, searching for comfort in a world that had abandoned them. Despite the pain and the fear, there was a flicker of something else in the air. The children had been through so much already, their lives marked by the horrors of war. But now, in this moment of crisis, something stirred within them. They had survived the collapse, and they had each other. In the face of death, they still had hope. It was fragile, but it was there, buried beneath the rubble, waiting to be uncovered. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the children sat in stunned silence, each of them processing what had happened in their own way. Some cried, some whispered prayers, and some simply stared at the twisted wreckage around them. But in that silence there was a shared understanding. This was only the beginning. The collapse of their school had marked the end of one life and the beginning of another, one they could not yet comprehend. The hours passed slowly after the collapse, each minute stretching longer than the last. The air inside the wreckage was thick with dust and the acrid smell of smoke, making every breath feel like a struggle. The children, huddled together in the remnants of their classrooms, tried to make sense of the chaos around them. Some were still in shock, their eyes vacant as they stared at the crumbled walls and broken windows. Others cried for their parents, their voices lost in the deep silence of the destroyed school. Despite the overwhelming despair, a few of the older children began to take action. They realized that staying in the rubble would only make them more vulnerable, and if there was any hope of survival, they would need to find a way out. The youngest, barely able to walk on their own, needed to be carried or guided. The older children, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, took charge, trying to keep calm and encourage the others. But even they were frightened, their hands trembling as they reached for the children around them. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of military vehicles and gunfire. It was clear that the war was not over. The battle was still raging outside, and the school, once a place of safety and learning, had now become a deadly trap. Every moment felt like a countdown, a race against time. The children, unsure of what to do next, clung to the few fragments of familiarity that remained: their friends, their teachers, and the memory of the world before the disaster. As the day wore on, the survivors started to organize themselves. The older children moved cautiously through the rubble, searching for any signs of life. Their hands scraped against the cold, jagged concrete, feeling for any movement beneath the layers of debris. They knew that the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the trapped children and teachers would perish. With every search, their hearts sank, and the realization that they were surrounded by death began to settle in. The dust was so thick in some parts of the school that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The children had to rely on their sense of touch, feeling their way through the wreckage. Each piece of debris they moved aside felt like a small victory, but each failure was a crushing blow. The sound of their breathing echoed in the silence, punctuated only by the occasional muffled cry or gasp for help. It was a haunting, eerie sound that made them feel more isolated with each passing minute. In one of the classrooms, they found a group of younger children who had somehow managed to escape the worst of the collapse. They were hidden beneath a desk, their faces pale and streaked with tears. They hadn't moved since the explosion, too terrified to leave the safety of their small hiding place. The older children gently coaxed them out, offering them whatever comfort they could in their broken state. But there was no time to dwell on their safety. The rest of the school was still filled with the sounds of those who were trapped. There was no help in sight. The sounds of battle from outside had become more distant, and the children realized that they were alone. Their survival depended entirely on their own resourcefulness and determination. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the ruined school, they knew they would need to act fast if they wanted to escape the inevitable collapse of the building. The teachers, once the guiding figures in their lives, were now among the missing. The children searched desperately, calling out their names, hoping for a response, but the school remained silent, as though it had swallowed them whole. The realization began to sink in. Their teachers, the adults who had once cared for them, were likely lost forever. It was a hard truth, one that no child should ever have to face, but it was a reality they could no longer ignore. Fear and exhaustion began to set in, and the children struggled to keep their spirits up. They gathered what little food they could find, the scraps left behind by the teachers and other students, and shared it among themselves. The hunger gnawed at them, but the fear of what awaited them outside was worse. They had no way of knowing whether the soldiers would come for them or whether they would be left to fend for themselves in the midst of the war. As the darkness of the evening closed in, the children huddled together in what was left of the school's common area. The light from their small makeshift fires flickered in the dark, casting shadows across their faces. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of their families, their hopes and their fears. In those quiet moments, they clung to each other, their voices a fragile thread holding them together in the face of unimaginable loss. Outside, the battle raged on, but within the walls of the ruined school, the children found something that could not be destroyed by war: their will to survive. They knew that the next day would bring new challenges, but for now, they held on to each other, hoping that somehow they would make it out of the darkness alive. The days blurred together as the children continued to search through the rubble, each moment marked by the weight of uncertainty and exhaustion. Time felt irrelevant in the darkness of the collapsed school. The distinction between night and day was lost beneath layers of dust and debris. Every few hours, the children would pause for a moment of rest, only to return to their desperate task, digging, moving rubble, and calling out for the lost. But as each hour passed, their hope began to fade, like the dying light from their small fires. Some of the children, now growing weaker with hunger and fear, had begun to retreat into silence. The younger ones clung to the older children, seeking solace in their presence. But even the older ones, once so full of life, had begun to feel the crushing weight of the situation. Their muscles ached from the constant movement, their hands raw from lifting debris and searching for survivors. But it was not the physical exhaustion that haunted them most. It was the knowledge that every passing moment brought them closer to the edge of despair. The search was slow and methodical, but the children had little choice but to press on. Every time they thought they had found a safe space, another section of the building would collapse, sending them scrambling to avoid being trapped. There was no room for error. They knew that the next move, the next decision, could be their last. But amidst the fear, they also found moments of strength. They encouraged each other, whispered words of comfort, and tried to hold on to the memory of better days. But each time they moved another stone or shifted another beam, their hopes were dashed as they found nothing but more destruction. In one of the classrooms, a few of the older children had begun to organize the younger ones into small groups, telling them to stay together and conserve energy. They created a makeshift shelter of sorts, using scraps of wood and cloth to protect the children from the elements. But even in this tiny moment of structure, they could not escape the crushing reality of their situation. They were still trapped, still at the mercy of the rubble that surrounded them. The faint sound of artillery fire outside seemed to remind them that they were in the midst of a war they could not escape. As they continued to dig, the children's fears grew more real. They had already lost so much: friends, teachers, the school itself, and now they faced the possibility of losing each other. It was becoming clear that not all of them would make it out alive. Every time they found a child who had been crushed by the rubble, every time they discovered an empty space where once there had been laughter and joy, the weight of the situation became harder to bear. It was one thing to fear death in the abstract, but it was another to see its presence everywhere they turned. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there were still moments of defiance. One by one, the children began to show resilience in the face of fear. Some continued to search for survivors, refusing to give in to the hopelessness around them. Others, though weary, stood watch over their fellow survivors, making sure no one was left behind. They were a community now, bound together by the shared trauma of their experience. The bond that had once been forged in the classroom now held them together in the darkness of the school's ruins. As the days wore on, the small group of survivors grew tighter, but so did their fear. Each new sound, whether it was a creak of the building or the distant rumble of artillery, sent waves of panic through them. The constant tension between hope and despair became unbearable. One of the younger children, a boy named Kenji, had begun to cry quietly, unable to understand why no one had come to help. His tears seemed to echo in the silence of the school, a reminder of the innocence that had been lost in an instant. In the evenings, when the search for survivors had slowed, the children would sit together, trying to comfort each other in their own way. They shared their meager rations, trading scraps of food for stories of their past lives. They spoke of their families, of the lives they had left behind, and of the dreams they once had. It was a small solace, but it allowed them to hold on to the humanity they feared was slipping away. Even in the face of such overwhelming tragedy, they still held on to the memories of who they were before the collapse. But as the days turned into weeks, their physical condition deteriorated. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, and the lack of clean water made every drop feel like a precious treasure. The older children, who had been their leaders, began to weaken as well. The weight of responsibility was taking its toll, and many began to doubt whether they would be able to lead their group out of this nightmare. It was a hard reality to face, but they knew that survival was no longer guaranteed. One evening, as the children gathered around their small fire, a loud rumble shook the school, sending tremors through the ground. The children froze, their eyes wide with fear, waiting for the building to collapse further. But this time it was different. The tremors stopped, and in the silence that followed, they heard it, a faint, distant voice. It was the first sound of hope they had heard in days. Someone was out there, someone who might have come to rescue them. But even then, there was a sense of dread. Would this be another false hope? Another cruel reminder of the world they had lost? With a collective breath, the children prepared to find out, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the collapsed building, the children held their breath, listening. The distant sounds they had once heard so clearly, the explosions, the shouts, the war, seemed to be fading away, as if the world outside was becoming something distant, something unreachable. But inside the rubble, the fear of what might come next only grew stronger. Each child was left with the haunting uncertainty of their situation, no longer certain whether the sounds they'd heard were a sign of help or the deepening of their nightmare. The faint voices they had heard the night before seemed to be a trick of the mind, a false hope. Yet, despite the crushing weight of despair, the possibility of rescue was enough to stir something in them, a flicker of life in the deepest parts of their souls. The older children, still carrying the heavy burden of leadership, decided they couldn't just sit in silence. With shaking hands and trembling hearts, they began moving the rubble with more urgency, determined to find an escape. Each piece they removed from the wreckage felt like another step closer to a future they thought was lost forever. But as they dug deeper, the reality of their physical limits became apparent. Their arms ached, their bodies growing weaker from the lack of food and water. The constant noise of shifting debris filled the air, but it was no longer a sound of possibility. It was the sound of desperation. The walls around them seemed to close in tighter with every movement, making them question whether they were truly making progress or just digging themselves deeper into the ruins. The children, too young to truly grasp the magnitude of their situation, had begun to falter. Some had fallen asleep in the corners of the classroom, their exhaustion overwhelming them, while others clung to the walls for support. The older children, trying to remain strong for them, felt the weight of their responsibility more than ever. They knew that the longer they waited, the harder it would be to survive. Yet they had no choice but to press on. Time was no longer a luxury they could afford. As the hours passed, the faint voices they had heard earlier became clearer. It was a small group of soldiers, their voices muffled by the debris in the distance. The children, hearing the language they did not understand, but somehow recognized as a symbol of hope, rushed to clear away the rubble even faster. There was something almost divine in the way they worked. Each shove of debris felt like a prayer, each movement made in the belief that salvation was within reach. But as they dug, the thought nagged at them. What if this was just another illusion? What if these soldiers were just as lost as they were? The deeper they dug, the more it became clear they were running out of time. The building structure, already compromised by the explosion and the collapse, was beginning to shift dangerously. The ground beneath their feet seemed to groan with the weight of the fallen walls above them. It was only a matter of time before the building would give way completely, and with it, any hope of escape. The children's breaths became shallow, the air heavy with the dust and smoke from the previous day's destruction. Each movement felt like it could be their last. Despite the fear, the older children pressed on. They had seen too many of their peers already crushed by the rubble, and they couldn't bear the thought of losing more. The realization that they might not make it out of this alive crossed their minds constantly, but there was something more powerful that pushed them forward: hope, and the responsibility they had to protect the younger ones. They couldn't let them down now. The faint sound of boots crunching against the gravel finally reached them. At first, it was indistinguishable, but soon they could hear the distinct movement of soldiers searching through the debris. They could feel the earth shifting above them as the soldiers began to search, inching closer. It was then that they realized they weren't alone. The possibility of rescue was no longer just a dream. It was real. With renewed energy, the children worked as fast as they could. They shouted, their voices hoarse from days of thirst and fear. But in the midst of the chaos, they heard it, a voice calling back to them. The soldiers had heard their cries. Slowly, cautiously, the soldiers began to pull away the final pieces of rubble. It felt like a miracle, but they weren't free yet. The way ahead was still blocked, and there was no telling how much longer the building could hold. As the last few pieces of stone were lifted, a soldier's face appeared, grim yet compassionate. His eyes searched the children's faces as if to make sure they were real, not just a figment of his imagination. His voice was steady, but filled with relief as he called out to the others, "We found them!" The words echoed through the children's minds, and for the first time in days, they felt the weight of fear begin to lift. They had survived. They weren't alone. The soldiers were here. The older children, who had been leading the effort to free the others, stood still for a moment. They watched as their peers were carefully pulled from the wreckage, the reality of the rescue sinking in slowly. The bodies, once stiff with fear, were now gently cradled in the arms of the soldiers. Some were too weak to stand, others too injured to walk, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. But as the soldiers led the children out into the open air, they knew the fight wasn't over. The war was still raging. The scars of this experience would stay with them forever, but for now, they had won the first battle: survival. As the soldiers led the children from the wreckage, the bright light of the outside world felt like a shock to their senses. For days, they had been trapped in darkness, with only the faint glow of fires and the cold shadow of the collapsing building to guide them. Now, the sunlight was blinding, the air fresh but sharp, and the sound of the world seemed louder than ever. The children, still in shock, shielded their eyes from the harsh brightness. It was as if they had stepped out of one reality and into another, one where life could be rebuilt, but nothing would ever be the same again. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, guiding the children through the debris and rubble toward a makeshift camp set up nearby. There were no grand celebrations, no loud cheers. Instead, there was a quiet recognition of the fragility of the moment. Every child who had been rescued was a small victory, but the reality of their situation was still overwhelming. They had survived the collapse, but survival meant something different now. It meant grappling with the aftermath, with the memories of those they had lost, and with the deep, gnawing sense of uncertainty about what would come next. The children, some still too weak to walk, were carried by the soldiers to safety. The older ones helped the younger ones, supporting them with trembling hands as they staggered through the uneven terrain. Each step felt like a new beginning, but also a reminder of the brutal reality they had left behind. The school, once a place of warmth and learning, now stood as a hollow shell of its former self. It was a symbol of everything they had lost, and yet, as they walked away from it, the children could feel the weight of their past pressing down on them. They had lost so much, but they had gained something too, the knowledge that survival, however painful, was possible. Once they reached the camp, the children were given water, food, and a place to rest. The soldiers, too, took a moment to breathe, their exhaustion visible on their faces. There was no time for rest, however. The work of caring for the survivors had only just begun. The children were exhausted, their bodies weak from days of hunger and fear, and the soldiers knew they needed to act quickly to stabilize their condition. But even as they tended to the children's wounds and comforted them, there was a sense of dread in the air. The war had not ended, and the battle for survival was far from over. As the days passed, the survivors began to adjust to their new reality. They were no longer confined to the rubble of the school, but they were still far from safe. The soldiers made efforts to secure the area, setting up more tents and organizing food and medical supplies. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance. The children, too, had to adjust. Their bodies had been through so much, and it would take time to heal. But the mental scars would take longer to fade. The memories of the collapse, of the cries of the lost, of the feeling of being trapped in darkness, they would stay with them, haunting them in the quiet moments when they tried to sleep. The older children, who had become the unofficial leaders of the group, began to organize small groups to help the younger ones. They taught them to take care of their basic needs, to help one another, and to preserve what little hope remained. There was a sense of unity among the survivors, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of their shared trauma. But despite the efforts to rebuild, there was still an undercurrent of fear. No one knew what would happen next. Would they stay here, or would the soldiers be forced to move again? Would the war reach them here, in this fragile haven they had created? One evening, as the children sat around a small fire, one of the younger girls, who had been too frightened to speak for days, suddenly asked a question that echoed in the hearts of everyone around her. "Will we ever see our families again?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one had an answer. They had been separated from their families in the chaos, and there was no way of knowing who had survived or where they were. The uncertainty hung over them like a dark cloud. All they could do was wait, but waiting felt like a kind of torture. The fear of the unknown gnawed at them, making every passing day feel like an eternity. As the nights grew colder, the children huddled together for warmth, clinging to each other for comfort. The soldiers, though they tried to remain strong for the children, were also feeling the weight of the situation. They had seen too much death, too much destruction, to ignore the toll it had taken on them. But in the midst of it all, there was something powerful in the way the children clung to hope. Despite everything they had endured, they still had the will to survive. And that will to survive became their most precious resource. The soldiers continued to work tirelessly, providing for the children and ensuring their safety. Some had families of their own, others did not, but they all understood the importance of what they were doing. It was not just a mission to provide aid, it was a chance to restore some semblance of humanity in a world that had been torn apart. For the soldiers, the children were a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. And for the children, the soldiers were a lifeline, a symbol of the possibility of redemption in a world that seemed to have lost its way. But as the days wore on, the children began to grow restless. They had survived the collapse, they had been rescued, but now they faced the harsh reality of what survival meant. They were still at war, still trapped in a world that had turned its back on them. They had been given a second chance, but what would they do with it? And would they ever be able to find peace in the aftermath of so much loss? The answers to those questions remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The children had been forever changed. The war had stolen much from them, but it had also given them something they could never lose, a deep understanding of the value of life, of hope, and of the human spirit. They had fought to survive, and in doing so, they had shown that even in the darkest of times, there was a light that could never be extinguished. The days following their rescue were a blur of uncertainty and adaptation. The children, once trapped in the ruins of their school, were now in the hands of soldiers who had become their lifeline. The transition from survival in the darkness to the tentative light of a refugee camp was jarring. It wasn't just the change in environment, the fresh air, the clear sky, but the overwhelming reality that the world outside was still in chaos, and they were still in the middle of it. Their bodies, weak from days of deprivation, struggled to adjust to the new rhythm of life. But their spirits, though scarred, began to stir with the hope of rebuilding. The soldiers, while trying to maintain a sense of order, were stretched thin. They worked tirelessly to distribute food, provide medical care, and keep watch over the survivors. It was clear that the children's physical health would take time to recover, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. Many of the younger children had barely spoken since the collapse, their minds too traumatized to process what had happened. Others clung desperately to the older children, who, despite their own exhaustion, had become their caretakers. There was no formal structure to their recovery, only the quiet acts of kindness and the shared experience of survival that bound them together. The camp was sparse. Tents were pitched in rows, and the survivors, though grateful for the shelter, found the space still too small, too close. The days blurred into one another as they waited for news of their families, but no word came. The uncertainty of whether their loved ones had survived the chaos was a constant ache in their hearts. Yet, amidst the waiting, there was something else, a quiet sense of community beginning to form. The children, once scattered and lost, now found solace in the presence of each other. They whispered stories of their homes, their families, their past lives, trying to hold on to the fragments of a world that had been taken from them. One afternoon, a small group of the older children gathered around a fire. The fire was a symbol of warmth and survival, but it was also a place where memories could be shared, even if only in whispers. They spoke softly, recounting their experiences, piecing together the events that had led them to this moment. Some told stories of their families, how they had been separated, how they had hoped to see them again. Others shared the fear they had felt when the school collapsed, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had gripped them in the darkness. These stories were their way of reclaiming some part of themselves, of putting words to the pain they had endured. But even as they shared, there was a lingering silence between them, an unspoken understanding that some things could never be fully explained or healed. The youngest children, meanwhile, had begun to adjust more quickly than their older counterparts. Though still haunted by the trauma they had witnessed, they found solace in the small routines of the camp, learning to wash their faces, to find food, to play with the other children. They were too young to fully comprehend the depth of their loss, but they still carried the weight of it, manifesting in quiet moments when they would cry without explanation or cling tightly to those around them. For them, survival had become something instinctual, something they knew in their bones but could not fully grasp. The days turned into weeks. The children's recovery became less about physical needs and more about emotional healing. The soldiers, though still focused on their duties, began to see the children not just as survivors, but as the future. They knew that the war had scarred them in ways that would take years to heal, but they also saw glimpses of resilience in the way the children cared for one another. It was small moments, a hand held in the dark, a shared piece of bread, a comforting touch, that began to build the foundation of a new life. The older children, once the leaders in the chaos of the rubble, now became the bridge between the soldiers and the younger ones. They acted as translators, as caretakers, as teachers. In their quiet way, they began to lead again, but this time it wasn't a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future. They taught the younger children how to read and write again, using scraps of paper and broken pencils. They began to form makeshift schools, where the lessons were not just about survival, but about remembering who they were before the war. The sense of community in the camp grew stronger with each passing day. The soldiers and the survivors, despite the differences between them, began to share more than just food and shelter. They shared stories, smiles, and moments of human connection. For some of the soldiers, this experience was transformative. They had entered the war with a certain understanding of the world, but now, in the face of these children's resilience, they found their perceptions shifting. The enemy, they realized, was not always as faceless as they had believed. There were stories here, stories of survival, of courage, of hope, that had nothing to do with the battlefield. In the evenings, the camp would fall quiet. The sounds of the war, though distant, were always present, but in the camp there was a fragile peace. The children, many of whom had once been too afraid to sleep, now rested more easily. They would curl up together in their tents, their faces soft in the dim light. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a sense of safety, a sense that, no matter what had been lost, something could still be rebuilt. It was a slow process, a painful one, but each day that passed brought them a little closer to something resembling normality. They had survived the worst, and now they had to learn to live again.